Light out of darkness, on the dramatic connection between dreams and the Eucharist. Ladies and gentlemen, here with you today, I am in the fortunate position of speaking to artists who will perhaps respond favorably to my highly subjective remarks, which are influenced by my own experience. Favorably insofar as you all implicitly live on images, deal with images, and convey your inner images to the outside world. I'm dealing with individuals who, conscious of the creative principle, give explicit expression to their lived feeling, their affect, their painful experience of a conflict, to an idea, inspiration, or vision that has occurred to them, all of which are dream relatives. Let me clarify the essence of this list by rephrasing it. I'm dealing with individuals, artists, who, as such, give expression to the feeling that overcame them, the affect that rode them, the inescapable conflict from which they nevertheless wanted to flee, the lightning-like idea, the I don't know from where inspiration that came to them, or the mysterious fascination of a dream holding them captive. In this new version, it becomes clearer that while we have worked on all this, on these our images, we nevertheless did not cause them, did not make them. When they appeared to us, we became their location, their vessel, but they, these dream relatives and the dream itself, admittedly had their rise and origin in the unconscious, in our soul. We are forced to admit one thing. Yes, of course, strictly speaking, all this originates in our psyche, but then we prefer to look away, we prefer to forget about it, in the sense of we do make this one concession, namely that the images are not originally created by the ego, not a man-made construction, and therefore not originally subject to the ego. But that's it. Our concession does not result in any further obligation toward such an insight, which actually demands far-reaching consequences. Indeed, it would promote these consequences. But we turn away quietly and silently. That is exactly the point. I am concerned with finding a religious, that is, a personally committed, living relationship to our psyche, as we casually say, using the possessive pronoun, as if the psyche were ours, belonged to us, or as if we, the ego, were personally responsible for it, the psyche, for every content that we encounter in the soul, for every complex, every dream, as if the ego had made them, both dream and psyche, as if the ego had always been the master of its own house of the soul. So what I am concerned with is a religious, that is, an engaged attitude towards the psyche, and thus towards every problem that ultimately has its origin in this psyche. As you know, Jesus had the most subtle sensitivity for the human soul. The American depth psychologist Edward F. Edinger speaks of this in his book, Ego and Archetype. Quote, Jesus formulated the conception of psychological projection 2,000 years before depth psychology. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye with never a thought for, literal Greek is ou katanoes, you don't consider carefully, the great plank in your own eye, unquote. As I said, I'm concerned with a personally committed relationship to the psyche, and therefore to every problem. I understand problem in the original sense of the word, as that which is thrown before us, In principle, then, it is about a religious attitude towards images thrown before us, which present themselves to us as problematic, unpleasant, frighteningly ugly, either as fascinating imagery that captivates us or as seemingly meaningless images in dreams, indeed in every expression of the unconscious. I am concerned with those images that are deposited like orphans, God's orphans, before the threshold of our consciousness at night. Images, sometimes they're only scraps, fragments we remember. Images are words that the soul entrusts to us in this way. And when I say entrusts, I mean it in the sense of that passage in the Epistle to the Romans. Paul speaks of the Jews having been entrusted with the very words of God. Entrusted, I thought when I first read it more closely. I never quite looked at it that way. It sounded like someone who went away and entrusted his best to his best friend in his absence. Entrusted also in the sense of the parable of the talents. For what do we do with what is entrusted to us, be it much or little? What do we do with those dreams? We are damned if we sit on them, if we only bury what has been entrusted to us, if we do not use them in our lives, if we do not dare to apply ourselves to them, if we do not try to understand them, if we do not take action to incarnate them for Him. This is what is meant by realizing. I say for Him, the capitalized one, the ineffable, the tetragrammaton. C.G. Jung formulated it like this in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Quote, "The decisive question for man is, are you related to an infinite or not? That is the criterion of his life." Unquote. Because let's not delude ourselves. The whole drama in which we find ourselves, whether we know it or not, is not ultimately about us, but about the unnameable, about Him, this incomprehensible coincidentia oppositorum, this merging of all opposites, the opposites our human consciousness is based on, after all, into a unity that is inconceivable to us. We walk the dramatic serpentine path between the opposites for Him, as it says in the 23rd Psalm, for His name's sake. This may not suit us, it may even hurt us. On the other hand, seen from this perspective, everything is at stake now. And we are involved. We matter, playing a role for Him, filled with meaning. This idea, this for His name's sake, has become completely foreign to us. Estrangement is a synonym for alienation, the content of that expression, the meaning of a fact, namely that we do not live unto ourselves, but for an infinite, has nowadays sunk into rather unconscious realms. This changes nothing, not one iota, about the fact itself, the great dramatic archetypal pattern that continues to operate subliminally beyond our conscious consent. Viewed psychologically and empirically, that is, with the limited means of observation, with the limited knowledge and consciousness our ego possesses, and that we as human beings will only ever possess by virtue of such limitation, this subliminal divine drama itself seems to point to the pattern of an awakening consciousness gradually becoming apparent, a process which has been striving to realize itself over the course of thousands, even millions of years. That is the pattern of an individuation. But who or what would want to realize itself here, become conscious and, as it were, wake up? We do not know. But we play a role in this drama across the eons, one which, who knows, might be of importance. Who knows? God would know. Of the utmost importance. Yes, because we are apparently part of a divine drama, part of a drama between God and man. But we have to get out of it, to observe it from outside. And we can't do that by becoming conscious. We might. By leaving the unconsciously played role that we fearfully cling to, by jumping off the stage into the auditorium, as it were, in order to see what is happening up there on this stage, within us, around us, for us, and for him, and then to get back on stage, return to the drama, but now voluntarily, now consciously. Then we no longer play the drama blindly and unconsciously in our everyday lives, stomping along like the hordes of workers in Fritz Lang's Metropolis, métro, boulot, dodo, but are now partners in a challenging quest and struggle for meaning, as both Jacob and God struggled for meaning at the Jabbok. Then we consciously accept the drama with open eyes, and already dawn is broken. Jonah's sacrifice would have meant nothing if he had been pushed into the sea, but he jumped voluntarily of his own free will. Jesus' sacrifice would have meant nothing if he had not surrendered to God of his own free will. O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. Let me summarize our problem once more in a small image, a small scene I came across a few days ago. I was watching the first episode of a new season of True Detective, a Hollywood-produced series, this time set, tellingly, during the polar night in an Alaskan backwater. I heard the following dialogue as the female detective is suddenly asked by the man she came to question. "Do you believe in God?" he asks her. After a long pause, she answers, "Yes." And he, "Mind if I ask why?" She hesitates, then starts with 3 words, "My last tour." By tour, this detective and war veteran means her last war mission. "My last tour." She falters, because just then an image breaks through to her, like a dream, a vision, probably fed by a real memory, but like this only experienced in a dream, only now in this visitation by the unconscious. She sees a female soldier standing in front of her in the heat of the day, the left half of her face shot off as if blown away. A huge open wound gapes on the split face, and she sees how this halved face wants to whisper something to her and bends down to listen to it. But this is where the image, having lasted only seconds, breaks off. This dreamlike image, the image of a trauma, a visionary condensation of a deep battlefield shock. How could she explain what she had just seen to the person who had just asked if she believed in God? How could she express the vision? No one will understand anyway. So she breaks off wordlessly and replies, "It doesn't matter." And the man, who of course had not seen what had just been revealed to the detective in her mind's eye, says calmly, "Must be nice." "What?" "Knowing we're not alone." "No," she says. "We're alone. God too. This is an intensification of Job's problem, in that although the detective says that she believes in God, yes, she yet not only states the lack of connection between herself and God, but is resigned to it, accepts it, as if saying, that's how it is. I am alone, but so is he. Thus she accepts what Job never accepted. At this point, one should add decisively that she, the detective, does not recognize God, the dark God who confronts her in this eruption of the unconscious, this shattering vision lasting only seconds, cannot recognize him. So disfigured is he. So disfigured does he reflect his shadow, his tselem, in his image. So disfigured does the unconscious reflect our disfigurement, our state of being split, the personal alienation of this detective from the infinite, whom it would be necessary to discover in the actual search, so unclear to her, so dimly audible. The suffering face only whispers. As I said, she breaks off. It doesn't matter. There you have the misunderstood dream, which is being buried again, which is kept down, repressed. Here is the problem for all of us, is the image thrown before us in a sudden burst from the unconscious. It broke in like a thief, but finds no response, no expression, no katanoein, no diligent attention. Here, her problem is our problem, God's problem. We are without recognition, like the gaze of the former lover at the end of James Joyce's story, Evelyn, without recognition. Precisely this is also what the drama of our days consists of at present, our inner search for discovery, since the true detective I'm referring to does not search outside, but gnoti se auton, searches for the shadow within. We should not let this perceived or intuited separation between God and man, we are alone, but so is God, stand on its own and accept this alienation as permanent, fall prey to a rampant nihilism. We should consciously strive to restore the connection between God and man, Deo concedente, and the chances that he, Deus, concedes, allows this, wants this connection, inshallah, be'etzrat Hashem, God willing, are good. For purely empirically speaking, here the psychological rule applies that the unconscious, which I am synonymizing with God for our practical purposes here, because the immeasurable cannot be encompassed, but encompasses us, as the unconscious encompasses us from all sides. Once again, here the psychological rule applies that the unconscious, also as regards the compensatory function of the dreams it feeds us, behaves towards us, towards the ego in each of us, as we behave towards it, toward the unconscious. It acts, reacts on the basis of reciprocity. As you do unto me, it says, so I do unto you. In practical terms, this means, for example, that if you have a bad dream or remember a negative dream, in many, if not most cases, this is due to a negative attitude, your negative attitude towards the unconscious in everyday life, because you have hurt the unconscious when you repressively cool feelings or abandon them in cold blood, when you suppress natural instincts too strongly, or leave them in the dirt, or when you speak ill of the despised shadow, that eternal other within or without, in external reality, by maliciously, snobbishly, scathingly smearing this other with gossip. Then the unconscious reacts accordingly wounded, and tries to draw attention to itself, to your wrong attitude towards it. The more desperately crude the dream, the more desperate the unconscious is to draw attention to such an injury, to restore attention to its sovereignty. And if we don't wake up and become aware of it, after all, even a small gesture is sometimes enough to show awareness, to show that the ego sees it, sees the unconscious. If we don't become aware of it, it can resort to drastic means. It can break into our three-dimensional everyday life quite concretely, brutally, abruptly. Because in this case, it has remained unnoticed by the conscious mind. The individual has not responded to the dream, not even in an attempt, that would be the gesture I was talking about, to understand the image. And so it comes, as they say, suddenly upon us, overcomes us. The unconscious, as can be demonstrated by examining dreams and each dreamer's actual life circumstances, reacts with hostility when it is consciously or unconsciously hurt, mocked, disregarded, or neglected by the ego. And so the detective's God too, i.e. her aloneness or God's turning away, which she senses, can first of all be traced back to a possible violation, to a wounding, in response to which God has turned away, to a violation of the unconscious, a violation of God, next to whom the ego should have no other gods. Of course, this includes the demand that man should not declare himself to be a god or godlike, whether consciously or unconsciously. But this is exactly what happens during the usually unconscious process that we psychologically refer to as identification. God hides or is unconsciously hidden away by us when we identify ourselves with him as the highest value. This is precisely the moment when he disappears, the moment when the humanly limited ego too disappears, because at this point it has de facto declared itself a god. It has made itself, is the master of its psyche, and all the more urgently of everything that disturbs its house inside and out. And its house is the whole environment, indeed, ultimately, the whole world. This is the tyrant in us, the merciless Nazi and exterminator of feelings in us, the ice-cold rationalist, always calculating, computing the data, the scientist who identifies with his knowledge and has forgotten where it came from, indeed fails to see this at all, forgets nature, forgets his own nature too. That is the concupiscentia obsessed Trump in us, intoxicated by material values, who unfortunately does not know that he could only find salvation as a conscious ptochos to pneumati, as a beggar longing for spirit in the knowledge of his spiritual emptiness. Trump in us is this infantile, pompous shadow who exalts himself over everyone. Nothing counts but him, who identifies himself with the glorious nation and thus declares himself to be that highest value. God gave us Trump, according to the Make America Great Again supporters, and we should consider what image God is holding up to us with this. It is shameful. Whether splinter or beam-sized, we all have a Trump within us. He has even shown up in my dreams and was always devilishly friendly to me. Watch out. You can and you should know what it means when you wake up in bed with a guy like this. We should not deal with this kind of shadow content by defending ourselves, fending it off, suppressing it through self-reproach, but by becoming aware that it exists within us. We should allow it internally, acknowledge the shadow, its existence within us, so as not to be damned to live it out unconsciously in external reality. For it is precisely in this identified shadow of ours, in this blind spot where we naturally do not look for it and cannot find it, that God is hiding. Or to rephrase it, this is where we unconsciously keep him hidden. We ask, where is God, if we ask at all? In practice, however, we are quick to add megalomaniacally, there is only us. We're alone. Every day we know more, one day we know it all. This is psychological identification, psychological inflation. For to the extent that we reckon with infinities, we also believe we know infinitely much. At this stage, he has already been identified away, has become invisible in our inflation. We're alone. God, if he exists, is too. You probably already know or suspect what I will simply state in the following sentence. All this would change almost overnight, if we could think of the dreams which the unconscious sacrifices to us, offers up to us nightly as a holy communion, as a sacrament, as an aspect of the Eucharist, an aspect hitherto unrecognized, overlooked, disregarded, misunderstood. In other words, if we were able to regard the dream as a substance and psychic corpus of the highest value placed on the dreamer's tongue at night. For what purpose? To be assimilated by us as a dream substance, to be taken into us and digested by us, i.e., to be transformed into us. This means to incarnate in us out of this substance and to become reality as the so incarnated. In our lived three-dimensional everyday reality, this consideration of the daily dream as the host, which is offered up to us daily, but as supersubstantial nourishment, as artos epiousios, from the darkness, and which potentially contains groundbreaking light, namely when it, this dream host, conjoins itself to human consciousness in the conjunctio communio of the Eucharist, and transforms itself into a renewing awareness. This consideration of what has so far been left rather dark, the dark substance of the perhaps bitter-tasting dream, is as yet underestimated. But it would still be worth the personal experiment, i.e., the test, but test everything, says Paul, which everyone can always carry out. Even that which has hitherto been considered of no value, precisely this, would be worth testing again. For the fact that this host, coming in the form of the dream, that this dream as host is not always accepted, not always recognized as such, has its parallel image in Jesus saying about the least of these, whom he understands to be himself, to be synonymous with himself. These least ones, the despised, the sick, and the hungry, he is ultimately saying are not only to be found on the outside, they can also be found in our dreams. They are the psychological contents within us that we despise, prefer not to see, hold back, suppress. This is the shadow. And this shadow Jesus declares, quote, "For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger or needing clothes, or sick or in prison, and did not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Unquote. Jesus equates himself with these shadow contents in us, in each of us. He identifies with them. He says, "I am that shadow." In this way, Jesus himself equates what is dark, what is ignored, what is rejected in us with the highest value. I do not consider the dream Eucharist a substitute for communion, the Eucharist as we know it in the community of believers. Me genoito. May that never happen. Far be it from you, as St. Paul likes to say. Rather, I see in the gift of communion offered to us by the dream a perhaps previously underestimated and unnoticed parallel. Yes, a parallel action on the part of the unconscious, a parallel action which seeks a conscious connection, a connection too with external tradition. Why? In order to let the external tradition, via that crypt we've discovered here, in which we previously kept our dreams locked away, have a fundamentally supportive, complementary, revitalizing effect on the individual, in the individual. Because communion is primarily the common cause of a community, a collective. But the dream only comes to each one individually, comes as a unique experience to him or her, never as the same to different individuals. It doesn't come consistently, not like clockwork, but happens now, during certain phases of the night. It comes, if we consider it properly, completely focused on us, on our condition, on our conflict. It comes as a compensating substance, minted or coined for us, one that aims at the center of the psyche, aiming to realign us with it, to restore a right attitude, a balanced attitude, to lead us to a solution and an invigorating sense of meaning. If we not only see it, this dream, but follow it up, examine it with awareness in waking life. According to St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, we should examine ourselves before communion. Quote, "Let each one examine himself. Only then let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For whoever eats and drinks without considering that it is the body of the Lord brings judgment on himself by eating and drinking." Unquote. For the dreams Eucharist, however, which I am pointing to here, this test, this examination, is mirrored as a self-examination happening after the fact, i.e., after the dream, retrospectively. Without the examination after the dream, the substance, this dream coin, can only be used unconsciously. In most cases, you simply get stuck in a mood, in a foggy feeling. It cannot become consciously effective. Yes, but for God's sake, some of you will be thinking by now, who after all has the time? Who, for God's sake, has the time to do all this, to examine it, to write it down, to follow it up, to unravel these puzzling images, this dark and also very often absolutely nasty and repulsive stuff that is served up to us during the night. To write it down, to trace its meaning, let alone to extract anything from it that's useful for me. You're absolutely right. Yes, there is a cost. It really costs something. This has a touch of that episode about the rich young man who was supposed to give everything to the poor in order to follow Jesus. For God's sake, why everything after all? It is a relief to admit, based on experience, that the unconscious is not so strict and is certainly willing to compromise. That small gesture of goodwill on the part of the ego is taken into account by the unconscious. It registers it as a certain attention given it on your part. For example, the short dream note that I put on my desk only to find it again when I return home in the evening, I look at it again. Maybe I still don't understand anything, but I have looked at the message again. I didn't say, "I don't know you." With my gesture, I said something to the effect of, "I know you exist. I just don't understand, not at all, what you want with your dream image." This gesture is already something. It's meaningful, honest, it counts. This gesture will almost certainly be answered by the unconscious in one of your next dreams, whether you will like the answer or not. Because now, with your little gesture admitting helplessness, powerlessness, you have already started a dialogue. For God's sake, the unconscious will respond. The bridge is there, present now. The communion host of your dream is on its way to living with you, to be transformed and be incarnated into you. But how shall this be? Some will ask. This often disgusting, cruel, obscene, despised, suppressed, deeply shameful content that dreams serve up to me, how am I supposed to digest this stuff in the presence of mine enemies? How can I consciously process these images, examine them with consciousness, rational thinking and feeling, with intuition and sensation, let alone assimilate them? Yikes. But the voice spoke to Peter, God's voice, during the vision in Joppa. Peter recounts, quote, "I saw a vessel come down from heaven like a great linen cloth, let down from 4 corners. It came to me. When I looked closely, I saw 4-footed beasts of the earth and wild animals and creeping things and birds of the air. And I heard a voice saying to me, 'Arise, Peter, slay and eat.' But I said, 'O Lord, no, for nothing base or unclean has ever entered my mouth.' But the voice answered the second time from heaven, 'What God has made clean, do not call unclean.' And this was done 3 times. 3 times, because Peter denied 3 times that what was unclean was worth eating. 3 times he resisted. And all was taken up again into heaven." Unquote. So he missed his chance, someone might say. But then Peter reworked his dream, bethought himself, examined the image. What does this dream tell me? Why has it come to me now and here? And in what respect and why exactly do I refuse that which God wants me to slaughter and to take into myself? We use a knife to slaughter, to divide, dismember, dissect, distinguish, to differentiate. The knife is an archetypal tool, a tool for gaining consciousness. And then, soon after such reflection, such caution, such respect for the vision, the answer comes to him in real life. The proverbial bell rings, as it were, rings downstairs at the house in Joppa where Peter is staying. And now it is time to implement, to realize, to incarnate what he, Peter, has intuitively extracted from the dream as its meaning, i.e., as the direction in which he is to continue on his way. This leads to the baptism of what is referred to as the first Gentile Christian, the Roman centurion Cornelius. Psychologically and inwardly understood, this is an example of the assimilation of the then generally dominant Roman power shadow, which, personified as Cornelius, is taken in by Peter in response to this dreamlike vision, is digested, as it were, and transformed, entrusted to him, the head of the early church. I would like to give you a few more examples from my own experience. I'll tell you about a therapeutic Zoom conversation I had a few weeks ago with Carrie Ann, an American friend who, as she said in her mail, wanted to ask my advice about a dream that was puzzling her. We had already shared such conversations a few times, unfortunately, always with a long interval between us. "Oh, it's actually nothing I'm bringing you here today," she's quick to state as soon as the Zoom connection is established. You may remember from earlier the detective's deflecting remark, "It doesn't matter." Many consider the dream, or what can still be reported about it, what images can still be scraped together from it, to be actually nothing. Even if they were shaken by the dream, they still manage to keep it small in their minds, to look down on it, so to speak. "Come on, what was that all about? It was nothing, hardly worth mentioning, so stop yammering." This attitude toward dreams, towards an offering from the unconscious, especially in the presence of another, in this case me, and hence in the harsh daylight of reality, is typical. It is as if the dream were dissolving into nothing again, because it cannot stand up to rationality. And so I remind Carrie Ann, "You've underestimated a dream like that once before, a trivial, everyday dream that didn't impress you at all, but saved your life." "What?" she says, and I can see that she has no idea what I'm talking about. "You were coming from Las Vegas back then." I took notes after our conversation. "You had landed at Burbank Airport. You were coming from some Vegas event with this director of horror movies, George Romero." "Yes," she says, and still doesn't remember the dream. I continue. "You'd organized a couple of events for the studio." She worked for a big Hollywood studio as a special events planner. They involved Romero's zombies playing the tables in Vegas in full costume. Then, the night before your flight back to Burbank, you had a small, seemingly meaningless dream. It was just a single image you saw that night. She still didn't remember. In your dream, you looked at a small area in your house where the box of cat litter sat, and you saw that the cat litter had not been replaced. It was completely soiled. And then you forgot the image again, slept for a few more hours before your flight back to Burbank. Here I saw something was dawning on her, but nothing concrete yet. The dream dated back a few years. Still, in retrospect, it's remarkable how we can forget something like this, how it simply falls back into the unconscious. From the airport in Burbank, I continued, you arrived via Hollywood Way at the red light by the intersection of Victory Boulevard. On the right-hand corner, you caught a glimpse of Petco, a pet supply store. You were the first in the center lane in front of this red light, and you were waiting for green to continue straight across the intersection. And at the very moment the light turns green, you were already pulling away. This image comes to you, Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, and you remember the vague dream image from the previous night, that container with dirty cat litter. You slam on the brakes. Yes, now she remembers. Yes, she says, because now, instead of going straight across, I wanted to make a sharp turn to the right to pull into the Petco parking lot, which of course wasn't immediately possible from the center lane I was in. And the car behind me was honking. It almost rear-ended me when I slammed on the brakes. He kept honking to get me to drive on, but I was as if frozen in place at that moment because I wanted to get to Petco first, to buy cat litter. She figured that her husband probably hadn't changed it during her absence. And once again, the guy behind me blasted his horn and was finally so angry that he passed me in the left lane and continued with a menacing gesture into the intersection where at that instant another car sped through the red light, colliding with him, dragging the car almost all the way across the intersection. As if in a trance, Carrie Ann then slowly made her right turn, pulled into Petco's lot, and all in a fog, couldn't get out of the car, in total shock. A thought entered her mind. I'll stay here. The police will arrive and want to question me. They did arrive, an ambulance too, but she remained seated, frozen, staring through the windshield of her car, watching as they pulled the dead man from the car that had been hit. She realized it was her, that it would have been her if in that very second she hadn't suddenly remembered the image, that seemingly meaningless dream image, soiled cat litter. She must have stayed in the car for over an hour until she got out, went shopping at Petco's, and returned home to hug her cats. Yes, now she remembered it all. I had completely forgotten, she said again, amazed at herself. You know, I said to her, perhaps your experience here is an example of the willingness of the unconscious to compromise. Because if we interpret the dream image in the context of your whole situation at the time, that image of the soiled cat litter would point to something in you, namely to a neglect of your feminine instincts, which your cats represent. Nobody took care of them. They, your instincts, live in their own filth. The ego doesn't see them, has neglected them. So they should be cared for, paid close attention to, these female instincts of yours, these deep and neglected drives, urges, impulses, these voiceless, unheard ones. They should be taken care of, said this seemingly insignificant dream, of which you had only remembered an image, only to forget it again immediately. They should get your attention. You should reconsider your innermost feelings, to allow them to emerge, to pay attention to them when they come forward impulsively. Yes, to recognize them as vital for you, even as you've experienced, even as saving your life. That was an example of the seemingly insignificant, the it doesn't matter, oh, it's nothing dream, which we always underestimate. Long pause. Carrie Ann reflected on all this. Then followed, again, typically, you might say, a second evasion. Oh, she said, it felt so nice to talk to me again, to be able to talk. We hadn't had time to catch up for a while. But last night, she said. Here comes the typical evasion, which, as it turned out, was another prelude to the shocking dream she wanted to tell me about. But the previous night, she said, she had met up with friends for a luxuriously extensive dinner talk, and they all had swapped stories. She too had told her story, the one about the special premiere of Spielberg's Schindler's List in Washington, D.C. And of course, everyone had listened to her, spellbound. I let her continue, although I already knew the story, perhaps because I suspected there might be a connection to that shocking, mysterious dream. In a conversation like this, which aims to express the dream, nothing should really be considered meaningless. Even digressions can provide clues. But I'll keep the story much shorter for now. She had organized this big first screening of Schindler's List in Washington, D.C., exclusively for celebrities. She had to submit to the wishes of the Secret Service because the president, Bill Clinton, and Hillary would be attending the premiere. The Secret Service man, very sympathetic, she said, had given her a purple pin which identified her as one who was not only allowed to get through every barrier past the Secret Service, but was also authorized, from the moment the Clinton limousine arrived in front of the venerable movie palace, to take Clinton by the elbow, touch the president, and thus escort him inside the theater. The Clintons were only led into the auditorium after everyone had been seated. No one was allowed to stand. The search dogs had gone through all the aisles for the third time. Then Carrie Ann was allowed to take Clinton by the elbow again. Huge applause broke out as they entered the auditorium, and Carrie Ann escorted Clinton down the center aisle to his and Hillary's seats. When the screening was over, everyone had to remain seated. Only she, Carrie Ann, led Bill Clinton, again by the elbow, up to the door into the foyer, followed by a few Secret Service people with Hillary. This had to be done quickly, not only because everyone was seated, probably still in shock. They had to remain in their seats as they were expressly instructed by a PA system, but also because you could already see that Hillary and Bill Clinton, Hillary could hardly hold back the tears, and Clinton was crying as soon as the hall doors had been closed behind them by the Secret Service. In the foyer, Clinton began to cry uncontrollably, without restraint. Carrie Ann's words describe what only she saw and the few Secret Service people who had come into the foyer with her. Clinton tried to hold it in, but in the foyer he started sobbing even more. The foyer was secured. No one could get in or out. Clinton went over the top. He was losing it. I mean, really, he was crying like a baby. The Secret Service cleared the men's room, secured it, and brought him right in. And another Secret Service agent stood outside, and nobody could get in. But they left Hillary alone in the foyer, and she was so upset that she pressed her face against a pillar, put her hands on either side of her face, and just cried. I was shocked that the Secret Service didn't take care of her and didn't provide a safe area for her. I'll stop here because Carrie Ann had now seen the decisive image, the image in the foyer, the one that only she had seen, that had revealed itself only to her, the image of the presidential couple dissolved in tears. It is an experience that leaves you wondering, am I dreaming? Do I really see what I'm seeing? And it has the quality of a dream, so it can certainly be read symbolically too, just as one would interpret a dream image. In America, it must be added, the presidential couple, unlike in Europe where we still have royalty, where this tradition is still alive, in America, the presidential couple has assumed this royal function, psychologically speaking. So in dreams, this couple symbolically represents something like representatives of the supreme value, representatives of the self, or collective dominant consciousness. When the dominant consciousness in a dream image, or as was the case here, in shocking, secretly revealed reality, is seen as being in dissolution, when king and queen are dissolved in tears, This would, if interpreted in terms of dream psychology, then herald a dissolution of dominant consciousness. For the individual, this might mean, if he or she does not allow themselves to be swept away by this image, i.e., if the individual does not identify with it, that the end of a certain hitherto collectively recognized dominant view of the world has dawned for her or him, for this individual. Something new is about to begin. The kind of thinking, the actions and activities which had been dominating her, Carrie Ann, as an individual, are dissolving. They will be replaced. This was years before her retirement and withdrawal from the entertainment business, where for decades she had served artists, organized events for the big names in the film industry, but had completely put herself, her own innermost instincts and ambitions on the back burner, not actually forgetting them, but repeatedly rejecting them. No time to write this, test that, or paint what she'd been feeling. She was totally absorbed in and subjugated by this business. In tasks she performed non-stop, day and night, for others, while denying herself the same. It wasn't a sacrifice, because you can only sacrifice what you have, what you consciously own and consciously sacrifice. And in that sense, she didn't really have what she suspected she had, but kept rejecting again and again. Of course, at the time, she would have been unable to psychologically classify that image with the Clintons. Neither was I. I didn't see it that way back then. I just thought of it as a very impressive curiosity, some sort of refined variety of gossip. To see the king, the royal couple, so naked, utterly human, in a state of dissolution, who could have imagined? That was the general tone and the level of my initial thoughts then. As soon as she had recounted the events of last night to me, she, who had denied herself to act on any deeper artistic ambition most of her life, had suppressed everything that pointed this way, all in order to serve those others, those stars. Now she no longer held back. Her deeply shattering personal dream, the one she had actually wanted to speak to me about, was as follows. A huge rock has broken loose from the mountain, a large mountain at the foot of which she had spent her childhood, has broken loose and is rolling towards me. It's coming at me faster and faster, but I stand rooted to the spot. It will crush me. In a moment it will smash into me, and just before it reaches me, I can make out words carved into the stone which read, "Be own stone." And then it races past me, hot, barely grazing me. That was the dream. As I said, it came weeks after she had retired. She was in her mid-60s and had been offered a lot of money to stay and carry on. But she had turned down all offers so that she could finally write down her drama, give it expression. The dream represents, depth psychologically speaking, this birth, more precisely, the birth of the self, symbolized here by the stone that was broken loose, the lapis non lapis, a stone cut out by no human hand. It broke loose by itself autonomously. This is an archetypal image, the stone and the motif of the stone not moved by human hands. You can find it, for example, in the book of Daniel, who interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream when he says, quote, "You, king, were lost in contemplation until a stone suddenly broke loose from the mountain without the hand of man. It struck the pillar on its feet of iron and clay and shattered it. Unquote. This is also in Nebuchadnezzar's dream the image of the dissolving, previously dominant consciousness with which Nebuchadnezzar was identified. He will dissolve this king and his kingdom. A new consciousness will arise. Quote, "But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth," we are told in the book of Daniel. This is the stone as a symbol of the Redeemer. And what does it tell Carrie Ann? Be on stone. Such a dream is to be treasured as an immensely positive image from the unconscious. A dream like this can never be fully interpreted. It is huge, numinous, unfathomable. But the stone with the message for her, indeed an assignment for her, for Carrie Ann, came to her, came at her, and meant her, she said. Only her, only this 65-year-old who had perhaps already rationally finished with her life from professional exhaustion. Because as soon as she left that Hollywood studio, her family moved in on her and took up all her energy as a matter of course. And in a transitional moment like this, it's so easy to slip back into the old pattern. Everyone else comes first, their needs always before yours. And as if from beyond the dream, deep in the unconscious, a divine agency were sacrificing something for this person, sacrificing something that had previously remained dark, in order to offer it to this one woman by casting the image down to her, throwing it in front of her. That stone rolled towards her, wildly offering her this piece of dark wisdom, the words of her Last Supper, the words of this offered up Eucharist, which she has been uttering again and again since that day. How often? Hearing the words again and again, repeating them inside her. Be on stone.